get started now. Sorry. Today is a great lesson. It's probably my favorite lesson in the Bible, my favorite story. Duane is going to teach it, and for those that don't know Duane, I actually brought my notes today about your history, which is in the past I've introduced her all along. She served in pastoral ministry for 35 years in the Florida and Georgia Cumberland Conference. She was the North American Division Associate Ministerial Director for 10 years, currently providing pastoral counseling and spiritual care for conference employees. I think they might need a little, care, spiritual care and counseling. She has 2 adults. She's a grandmother, and she brings something to our class that really rounds it out. So we'll get started right now. Rob, would you have our prayer?
Father in heaven, you've asked us to come to you and have this date on Sabbath. We praise you for your coming to earth and living. And we ask that you would open our minds and give us a glimpse of your love today. Help us to be more in love with you when we leave than we were when we came in. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
So along with Ken, this is one of my favorite stories in scripture. And I think there's many other stories that connect with this story, but we're going to focus right on just this simple passage because some of the other parts of the story, at least that commentators bring to the story, we will be addressing in later lessons. So my favorite part of our time together is our opportunity to share our own personal experiences. And so my question for you to share this morning is, share with us an encounter you had with someone that changed your life. Or a moment when you experienced mercy in a moment of shame. What was that like and how did it change your life?
One.
Yes.
Many years ago, we were on vacation with the kids and we were heading out to Glacier National Park. I forget where we were, but we stopped in the middle of nowhere gas station to get some fuel. And an elderly gentleman approaches our vehicle. And I'm not one to allow people to just walk right up to my vehicle, but he looked in the vehicle, he looked at Sharon, and he says, "How are you, ma'am?" And they greeted the children. And we started chatting, and he says, "I'm on my way back west from burying my wife up east, where she's from." And we chatted for a few more minutes, and he shook my hand and he says, "Plan your pleasures, your pains will plan themselves." And I never forgot that.
Wow. Plan your pleasures,
Your pains will plan themselves. They were Jerry Lawson, and I never forgot it. I even put it on my website.
Could you repeat that last line he said?
Plan your pleasures, your pains will plan themselves.
Someone else, an encounter you had with someone that changed your life.
Many moons ago, I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was waiting tables. And this one man, every time I would wait on him, was crying. And he started pouring his heart out, this terrible thing where his employees kind of did a mutiny and stole his business from him. Stayed friends with him and his wife, visited them, and they had just recently, since after I met them, went to a Revelation seminar. And then they started sharing this Jesus thing with me. And I'm like, oh no, Jesus freaks. And I was being polite. I was listening and listening. I went to go visit them, and their pastor was ever so coincidentally invited to come over to their house while I was there. And he sat down and started showing me how the Bible interprets itself, the symbols, the Bible tells you which one was. And I just found that absolutely fascinating because I had that friend of mine tell me I should really go to this fortune teller, told him all these things that there's no way they could have known. And I was suggested to read the Edgar Casey books and Shirley MacLaine, and I was not impressed with what I was reading, except they're crazy. But the fact that they went to the prophecy thing kind of intrigued me. So I found it so convincing and convicting that the Bible really was real for the first time in my life, that there really was such a thing as evil, that the Bible was true. It revealed all sorts of things. Immediately when I got back from traveling, and I looked up the nearest Seventh-day Adventist church, and the pastor started giving Bible studies, and then the rest is history. So just meeting that one customer that I was waiting on at tables and just befriending him in his time of sorrow just changed my whole world. We're glad. Say that now.
You never heard. What about a moment of mercy?
When I was in college, I was taking a class with Elder Witcheby. And it was a ministerial class. He came in one morning and said, "Why are you taking this class? Are you wanting to get out of the Korean War? What is it?" And it got me to thinking, and really made a difference in my life.
So I'm curious, what was your answer to him?
That's been 113 years ago.
I can answer that one, but I won't.
Oh, you won't. Okay. Okay, another incident of where you were shown mercy. What is it?
I don't know about mercy, but going back to your original question, we were just out of college, my wife and I, leaving college, and we had moved to Des Moines. And like a lot of young couples, it was easy to sleep in on Sabbath mornings and things like that. And there was an old man in the Des Moines church. He had to be 40. Perspective. Anyway, he had to be 40. And he basically took me under his wing and kind of played me back into church. And to the point that I was teaching the kids Sabbath school. And when Mindy and I got married a little over 2 years ago, we spent our honeymoon in Hawaii. And lo and behold, we visited a church there where a little boy that I taught was pastoring the church. So he was someone who made a big difference in my life.
Yes, but kind of reverse too. You made a big difference in his life, didn't you?
Potentially, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Ken.
When I was in college, at Southern Missionary College, there was a lady that was in charge of student finance named Laurel Wells.
Yep.
I couldn't pay my tuition bill. Year after year after year, I just couldn't swing the bat. She'd allow me to take my exams. She would allow me to take an odd job she'd create for me on campus so I could withdraw the money for cash when I was drowning in debt to the school. She showed me mercy.
Yeah.
Someday I would like to build a plaque or something in honor of Laurel Wells for mercy.
Yes, and there's many of us who could do that. I have my own story around that, where she saw my situation and went to bat for me.
Yeah.
You know, yes, there's many stories. Yeah.
I had a teacher in 1964 over at Collegedale Academy who was in charge of the oration competitions. And I was young, but anyway, I had an oration, and we had to do it by memory with no prompts or anything. And in my mind, as I turned the last page, and there were like 3 more lines to go, I couldn't remember that line. And I stood there on that stage, giving that oration, frozen with fear that I had just lost. I knew it was a great oration, but I'd just forgotten the last couple of lines. Couldn't get to that last page. And so I walked off in great shame. And he was my math teacher. He reached his hand out and he took my hand and he said, "There's always next year." And it just kind of showed me how to deal with anything that brought shame into my life.
Yeah. Beautiful.
It's just an opportunity that I'll get another.
Yes. Little moments like that make big differences.
Yeah. Back when I had just finished academy at Bass Memorial Academy, I stayed out 1 year before going to college to pay off my school bill in academy so I could go to college. And during that time, I was in a car accident. A lady ran the stop sign and hit me. And back then we didn't have seat belts, so that slung me out from under the wheel. My car jumped the curb, hit a tree. My face, part of me went through the windshield and back. And later on, when I got a job and was working at a doctor's office, I saw a mother of several little children who had been in a car accident, and she just didn't even have the right mind. And yet the Lord blessed me. I do have a good mind. And I just love the Lord. He blessed us with 4 children, and my husband was dyslexic, and he did mechanicing. He couldn't really read well. Back then we didn't address things like that, but I told my husband that our kids would be in church school if we had to sell the bed. We slept on the tuition. And I did borrow a bed from my mother-in-law for 8 years before I really got a bed of my own. But every time I prayed for the Lord to give me the money to pay the children's school bill, one day I said to my husband, we need $1,700 to pay the school bills. He said, well, you told you and the Lord would handle it, take care of it. I said, okay, Lord, I'm depending on you. My husband went to work the next day, and my husband had a car repair garage. And when somebody needed an engine or transmission, they didn't want to put that much money into their car. So Don would just buy it for $200 or $300, and when they were slow, he'd fix it up. He had put this car on the street of the block where his shop was. And the very next morning he got to work, that man was waiting on him. And Don wanted $2,300, and the man said, I have $2,000 cash, take it or leave it. We took it. He called me and said, honey, I've got your $1,700 and $300 for another car. Can you depend on God? Yes, you can. Ask him. You can ask him anything. And I just lost my husband in January, and we had not been able to attend this class for 2 years. And the next morning I was right here, and I was not in tears because God gave us a good life together. We have the hope of resurrection morning, and he just blesses me in so many ways.
Amen. So let's go transition to our story. This is a story of deep shame and great mercy. Page 115. And each went to his own home, talking about the religious leaders. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Women, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. I think it's truly impossible to understand this story in all its implications without understanding the cultural context in which it is happening. So the subtlety of the trap and the point that the author is trying to make here is wrapped up in the cultural context in which it's happening. So the Hebrew attitude, probably as you all know, changed over the years, but in the time of Israel, adultery was a capital offense with no chance of mitigation. You were stoned to death if you were accused of adultery, no question asked.
Woman only though, right?
No, not the biblical, both were supposed to be brought.
Okay.
Both were supposed, but that changed as time went on. In fact, there's no record of it ever having been carried out. It's almost like as soon as it was written down, that it no longer was used. Under the Babylonian captivity and the Asian invasion, a husband actually could redeem his wife and save her from being stoned. So, but it did become so that the marriage was automatically dissolved, no choice at all. It was just instantly dissolved if you were accused of adultery. And the woman was not allowed to marry her lover. She was prevented from marrying her lover. She may have escaped the penalty of death, but her standing in society was significantly impacted, very precarious.
What happened to the men?
Nothing.
Takes two to tango, but only one's guilty.
Yes, men got a free pass.
Men's were writing the rules.
Yes, men were writing the rules, right. So adultery was a woman's issue. Ken, go ahead.
I have heard, I don't know, some of the scholars are joking, but it really carried out that capital punishment.
Yeah.
A third of the men would have been destroyed in Israel.
Yes, I think that is true. Yeah. And the purpose of those kind of rules were to keep society pure and to know lineage issues. So if you're having an affair with somebody else and you're still married, for instance, whose child is this? Really. So yeah, men got a free pass. Adultery was considered a woman's issue. She was the seductress, the source of men's failure.
Yeah, it's about old women.
Yeah. So adultery brought shame to the woman alone, not the husband. Adultery was an offense against the husband. So, but he was the only one who had a right to bring the accusation. The offense was against him, therefore he was the one that had the right to bring the accusation. So even in the situation when men took advantage of women, whether they were single, betrothed, or married, that woman was disgraced forever, but she had to marry a rapist. And it was seen as better for a man to, better for the woman to be married than to endure the humiliation that society would put on her as a result of that. You could read Exodus 22, 16 to 17. But a man who had sex with an unmarried or a betrothed woman had to pay the dowry to the parents, as if he had negotiated for the relationship. He had to pay the 50 shekels and marry her. Another, right? I mean, this is horrible, isn't it? In our cultural view,
I'm not liking it.
So
Well, she asked a good question. She said, how is that different than prostitution?
how does what?
How is that any different than prostitution?
not much, and we'll get to that. So, but if a man suspected his wife, his new wife was not a virgin, in other words, he couldn't hang out the window, the sheet with her blood on it. He would go and make accusations to the parents. And if if the parents could prove that indeed she was a virgin, he had to pay the parents 100 shekels for giving her a bad name, falsely accusing her. And the parents retained the sheet of evidence after a wedding. You know, it was, I don't know if you know this about Jewish culture, but yeah, your wedding night, after intercourse, you hung the sheet out the window to prove that you had had intercourse and you were indeed legally married. That was part of the contract.
Now with social media, you don't have to have the sheet, you just put it on Facebook or
And these rules came from where?
Okay, so many of them from Moses' laws in the Old Testament, but there is much evidence that those laws were not laws of God. They were laws that came out of the oldest ancient communal laws that were there to protect society. And I can give you the name of that. I can't pronounce it, but yes, there were cultural laws that Moses' laws were based on. So, and that plays into the story as well. So, John.
Well, they spun it,
Yes,
but in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it states both are put to death.
yes,
It specifically states the man and the woman are put to death.
right.
That's the law. So now between this time and now, they spun it because, because men made the laws. So somehow they rationalized what it said there, because it specifically states both are put to death,
Right.
right?
Yes. So, so let's go back to the comment about prostitution. Prostitution was not deemed a sin. So the laws of Moses were designed to protect property. So a daughter was owned by her father. She was part of the workforce of the family to maintain the family. And her rights were transferred to her husband. That's why he paid the 50 shekels. It was to compensate the parents for the loss of work. So she goes from being property of her father to being property of her betrothed or husband. So a prostitute was not under legal contract. She wasn't bought or sold. She was a person who had been disregarded, like widowed, someone who had been raped, and the man, didn't come forward and marry her, or, so there could be other things where she was not owned. She could have been a slave or a free slave, not owned. So based on the cultural context that this story is happening in, what do you know about this woman?
She likely was not married.
Okay, but how could she have been committed adultery then?
Unless, of course, she was married to one of the Pharisees.
Okay, but it's possible that she was a prostitute. Yeah, it's possible. And that she's being accused of adultery because she's having sex with someone else who is married. Okay,
Well, she was caught, so either she was planted, he was planted, so she had to be caught
Okay,
or somebody was watching.
okay. What else do we know, possibly know?
Somebody who is caught feels trapped, like they have no control.
Okay, yes.
First of all, how does a man divorce a woman during these times? Like, what do you do? All he has to do is go outside his home and yell, "I'm divorced." That's basically what it is. And then the woman leaves the house with the kids. That's the divorce proceedings. So now what's the woman gonna do? She can't get a job. She's not hireable. She's a woman. She's gonna go live under a bridge somewhere with these kids. This was not uncommon. So before we talk too much about prostitution here, sometimes people get to a place in life where they are absolutely hopeless. And a lot of women in this position were in that position. Now, so that's why I can't help but think, and that's not uncommon. I believe if you want to put things in context, I think that's kind of normal during this time. So, I mean, this woman, it was something happened here where she was brought out onto a stage. So I believe she probably, I don't know, I'm guessing she probably was married. I'm guessing, because this was a scene that normally doesn't take place, because frankly, it's under the heading of no big deal, I think, if you look at it in the context of the time.
Okay, so if she was married, what's wrong with the picture that is happening?
Where's the husband?
Where's the husband? Okay, if she's not married, but she's engaged or betrothed, what's the problem? Huh?
Where's the fiance?
Where's the fiance? Yes. So who's accusing her? Who's accusing her?
The hypocrites.
The hypocrites, yes.
The Pharisees.
But you could ask, where's the father too, depending on what where's the father?
Oh, yes, so if she's single, she's not betrothed, she's not married, where's the father? Yes, defending her, that she's had an affair with a married man, where's the father?
Well, we're all in agreement, this is a farce. This is a staged. How can we screw Jesus?
Yes.
Let's get one of these girls here. And we'll watch the room right when they're hot and heavy. We'll walk in the room.
You ask, who is accusing her?
Right,
The church leaders are accusing.
okay, the church leaders are accusing her. So how do they know when, usually in secret, adultery happens? How do the leaders know?
Because they set it up.
They set it up.
They set it up.
It's probably one of them
Duane,
was the adulterer.
Well,
It was probably church leaders that
Yes,
was involved.
yes, so one of the church leaders, yes, Marlene,
probably one of her lovers set a trap for her and was accusing her. We don't know, but it was probably one of her lovers.
he was in on it, we know that. He was in on it.
right. So one of the leaders either was involved themselves and brought the accusation, but they are not doing the basic things when an accusation is supposed to be brought. They're not doing the fundamental things. So there was a ritual that if someone accuses someone of adultery, there was a ritual in the sanctuary to prove that they had committed adultery. Do any of you know what that was?
Drink the ocean.
The priest was supposed to mix the dust off of the sanctuary floor with water and feed it to the woman. And she would be cursed by being bloated and having intestinal problems. And that would be evidence that she was guilty. And if she didn't have those symptoms, then she was let off the hook.
But one of the things you got to keep in mind here, we go to cultural context.
Right.
As somebody said over here, in the heathen world, if I wanted a brunette tonight, I had a blonde, I just went out and said, I'm divorced. This one's getting stoned. And that's as all it was done. And he went and got the girl he wanted. God, our loving God, put that little potion thing in place because that protected the girl. Because if she didn't get the bloating and everything, then he was found to be at fault.
Yes. And most often, women who were guilty wouldn't go through the ritual. They would confess, but people that were innocent, drink it. Drink it.
I think John has a comment.
Jonathan, John?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
If a woman was married, death was prescribed to her, but the manner of dying was not prescribed. Whenever a woman was simply betrothed, that's whenever it was stoning that was appropriate for her. Now, and pursuant to your other question about where was the person that she is involved with, that sort of thing. Some people think that this woman was Mary Magdalene and that she was the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And in some of our readings, it says that her uncle led her into this situation. There was incest back then, just like there is now. And I have an idea that if her uncle had taken Mary, Martha, and Lazarus into his house, he was saying, well, my brother has died, and I'm putting out all this money, and I'm getting nothing in return. But I'll tell you what, Mary's beginning to look pretty good. I think I'm going to help myself to this. And then after he leads her into the adultery and that kind of a life, then she has to support herself by prostitution. And where is he? Well, he's not going to show up and say anything in her behalf because he's the one that led her into that lifestyle. And in fact, he probably would want her to be stoned so that nobody would find out what he did to her. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And if we put that whole picture together, we can easily go down that trail. But I want us to focus though here on the immediate story, because I do feel like what you're pointing out, John, is part of the picture and why this story is being included in the biblical narrative. Gordon?
It just struck me that what Jesus was doing there is he was trying to right a generic wrong, a cultural wrong. And, we'll be trying to move things a little bit more towards where we are.
What do the Pharisees or the religious leaders always quote when they're trying to trap Jesus? Some sort of law? Yes, Moses' law. They're always quoting Moses' law. When do they ever quote a 10 commandment to accuse Jesus? Maybe the Sabbath, but it's not even. But even that,
It was their interpretation of the Sabbath.
Right.
Well, this one was adultery of the 10 Commandments, though.
Yes, but what are they citing the 10 Commandments in accusation of her? They're saying the law of Moses said she should be stoned. They're not even, they're not citing the 10 Commandments as an evidence of what should be done, in that case.
I think people should be made aware that adultery in those days is different than what our modern society considers adultery. Bible times, if you had sex with someone who was not your spouse, but that was adultery. We now interpret it as only if you're married and you have sex with someone who's not your spouse.
No, that's true for them too.
Well, isn't adultery biblical that if you're having sex with anyone, if you're single and you have sex with someone that you're not married to, that is adultery?
No, that's in biblical language, that's fornication. Okay, so Is this a case where the laws of Moses and the laws of the Ten Commandments conflict? And the reason I ask this, Jesus often said, well, you have heard it said, but I say this. He's constantly pulling that contrast. You've heard it said, but I say this. And when Jesus kneels down and writes in the dust, what does he do? What is your hunch that he's doing?
He's exposing the people that are accusing.
Okay, he's exposing them.
He's writing down what they've done.
Think about the other times in scripture where you have seen the finger of God writing.
Many tekel you farson.
Yeah, so the Ten Commandments on stone, and then you reference.
That was in
That was
Daniel
me.
5, many tekel you farson, the hammer of God's hand. Right, you've been waiting the balances, and Nebuchadnezzar's grandson got his kingdom taken away.
Yes, I want you to notice in Daniel 5 that experience, because I think it's significant. Daniel 5. Look at what happens when Belteshazzar sees the writing on the wall. At the moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale, and his thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself, and his knees knocked together.
Not in the polite translation.
No. I mean,
It kind of brings a challenge with fear. Using fear, it brings a challenge to critical thinking. It causes them to have to do some critical thinking about the situation.
yes. So from my perspective, and this, is my perspective, I don't think God was specific, or Jesus was specifically writing out specific sins. I think he was writing God's words, his own words. That puts fear in people. That puts fear there. And they're trembling in their boots, so to speak. They're getting the hell out of there. Because, they're trembling in the presence of divine insight. Jesus looks at them and he knows their hearts. He knows knows what's going on. So.
One.
Okay, yes.
Oh, here.
Oh,
I had a question. I just wanted to clarify something. Are you, because it dawned on me when I read Daniel, do you think that Jesus wrote the mene tekel upharsin, meaning you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting? Because that would be another situation that they would be very familiar with. I don't know. I wasn't sure if that's what you
I
meant.
wasn't saying that, but that's a great insight that you may have been writing those very words because they know biblical history and they know there's only two incidences of God writing. Yeah.
Well, why do you think that the oldest down to the youngest left the scene first? I mean,
I don't know. What's your hunch?
I always thought that he was writing something specifically towards them and then they left one by one when they saw it. Maybe he wiped it out and then started writing something else and wiped it out, started writing something else.
from a logistical standpoint, if my job was to write something, so all of you knew Jerry's sins, starting from when he was a little boy to right now. Okay, how much ink would have to be in my typewriter for me to write all that stuff out? I'm picking. But how much time did Jesus have? We're talking seconds. So therefore, whatever he wrote down there, every one of those guys was reading something else.
Yeah. Word picture.
This was a miracle.
Yeah.
Writing in tongues. And Jesus just put a few marks down there and he saw his whole life. I saw my whole life, and those older guys, which were the ones that everybody had the most, if you were an old Pharisee, you were as close to God as you could get. All the other younger guys were wannabes. And yet those older guys saw their sins so much that they left first. Just because Jesus only had a few seconds. So I think it was a miracle going on.
Yes. So something's being translated.
Yeah.
So he was doing something like you say miraculous. So what is happening to the soul of these religious leaders as not only as they're bringing the lady and they're bringing this accusation, what is happening to them? What's their experience?
It could have been a come to Jesus moment, but it was up to them.
Yeah, could they have received forgiveness in that moment, just like?
Well, they could have suddenly saw themselves for real and said, oh my God, is this what I've been up to? Or they could just harden their heart and say, heck with this. We want what we want.
This is almost a precursor to the crucifixion. These guys have tried everything. And they're very frustrated because nothing they do works. So what are they left with? Cross.
The fact that they brought the woman to him instead of to the temple courts shows that this was obviously set up just to trap Jesus. And whatever it is he was writing in the sand, whether it was many technically farce, and you've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting, which is a blanket, you're just as guilty of sins, probably even same thing that she was being accused of, whether it was individual, whatever. Their attempt to deliberate setup, this little plan to trip up Jesus to do something where they would have grounds to complain about how they handled the situation, backfired and blew up in their face, and it was convicting them of their sin. And so they either left feeling very condemned and like, I better get out of here before I'm found out. I don't want him to speak my sin out loud because obviously he knows my heart. And so you would think that this would be a time for them to make the connection, the handwriting on the wall, he's writing the same thing, if it's mene. But there was not one that revered him for his insight and setting the situation straight as to really what was going on there. No one was transformed. They were just saving their own skin and just that much more angry at him.
We're hearing a lot from our class members this morning, but they didn't spend hours digging like you did. What is your opinion?
Amen.
Okay, so can I shape the narrative a little bit? Thank you, Ken. When I'm reading this story, I am reading the story in Zechariah 3. Are you familiar with that story? Where Joshua the high priest is being accused by Satan. Joshua's there with his dirty robes, all bloody, holes, full of holes. Joshua is there being criticized by who? The accuser of the brother, Satan himself. Okay? And the Lord steps up and said, the Lord redeems you. You're a brand plucked from the burning. Take your hands off of my servant. So these men have joined the ranks of Satan. If you look at Romans 2, let me see what verse that is. Here, you need to write it down. There's a powerful verse there that says, it is the kindness of God that leads to repentance. It is the kindness of God. Satan's voice is always accusatory. Always. It never expresses kindness. Even when you hear inside your head voices of contempt toward yourself, know that that's a voice of sin. It is not the voice of Jesus, because his voice is always kind. The kindness of God leads to repentance. And if you look at this story, what happens to this woman when she hears the words, neither do I condemn you? What happens? She falls at, go ahead.
Well, at that moment, she's been restored.
Yes.
She's been restored. And verse 12, which is the next verse that is not included in today's reading, it says, then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And here I see him contrasting darkness with light. And those who are in the darkest time of their experience is when Jesus is the closest to them.
Yes.
At their most desperate point in their lives, Jesus is the closest to them, because Jesus said that, you know, those who are well have no need of a physician. And so all the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, they thought themselves well. They felt like they had no need of Jesus. But this woman knew she needed Jesus.
Yes.
And so I think in our own experience, when we feel like we are in the darkest times of our lives, that's when Jesus is the closest to us.
Yes.
Ready to take us out of darkness into his marvelous light.
What is it about our sin? What is it about our sin that prevents us from seeing clearly other people? How does a lack of awareness of our own enormity of sinfulness preventing us from offering righteous judgment?
Sort of like, how can you pluck the splinter out of your neighbor's eye when the log is in your own eye? And in growing up, I had to learn that something called projection. When someone is in denial of their own guilt, they will project their flaws and their sins, whatever, on other people and accuse them of doing the very things that they do.
To me, one of the strongest things that is said in the Bible is judge not, that you be not judged. And that should give us all fear and trembling.
Don?
What I was thinking, Stacy was saying about the fact that they were all leaving. I can't imagine Christ in a public place without a lot of people around them, including the Pharisees. But what we see in the story is that the only person left was the woman that he talked to. So what I think to me is happening is that everyone was looking at their own sinfulness, because we've all sinned, as Romans says. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so it affected them. But I think the point that was made a minute ago by Ruth, that Christ is always ready to take us in our darkest moment and give us light. And that's important for us to do.
One,
So, yes.
Marie has some comments.
Okay, Marie. So he could possibly be writing dates and places and starting with the older priests that only God could have known. An important idea is that Jesus did not shame anyone openly in contest to the way the leaders were acting, in contrast to the way the leaders were acting. Yes. So I want to talk, go ahead.
Well, sometimes we talk about leveling the playing field and, making things fair. And I kind of think that's what Jesus did, because he had the ability to know these fellows, know everybody's complete life. So all it would take, I agree with what Rod said, but all it would take would be one word. Each of us struggles with at least one weakness, right? I don't know what they are, but he does. I know my own, I think. But at any rate, one word, and that's where they were out of there.
So this woman obviously has gone through trauma. There is something that has led her into adultery. Yes, she was set up by the leaders, but there also may have been other factors. And I wonder if we really understand the implications, and I'm getting a little psychological here, of when there are sexual violations in one's life. What are the implications for someone? Let's say she was a prostitute. Let's say she was a single woman that had been raped, and she ends up living on the streets to make a living, which we suspect was the case. What happens to us when we have gone through sexual trauma? So often, we look down on the prostitute, or we look down on the person with mental health issues as a result of their life experiences. We look down on people who have addictions, whether that's food addictions or sex addictions or whatever. We look down on them. Go ahead.
As a therapist, I've met many women that have experienced those kinds of things. And the common denominator in each one of them is something inside of them had been wounded and damaged, and I called it their soul.
Right.
Their interface with God had been destroyed, or at least greatly damaged.
Their ability to have a connection with God is extremely big. So when we have had trauma, that interrupts the fabric of who we are. It hurts us significantly. Our boundaries have been violated. And so we try to resolve those things. And we try to resolve them by reenactment. So if you see someone who is sexually promiscuous, for instance, know that they have gone through major trauma. Their story, you don't know their story. You only see their behavior in the moment. You don't know it. But they're trying to repair from the trauma that they have gone through. They lose their voice. They're unable to protect themselves. And they hate themselves for what they're continuing to do as a result of what's happened to them. They become self-contemptuous because of that. Lack of love from your primary caregivers, lack of love from your community in those kind of situations gets us stuck psychologically. So as individuals and collectively, when we criticize people with addictions or sexual deviant behavior, without any awareness of the contributing factors that have come to their life, we are doing what the Pharisees did. We are joining Satan in destroying their lives. In contrast, what do we see Jesus do?
He restores.
Yes. What does he do?
Doesn't condemn.
No condemnation. He knows her heart. He knows every detail of her life. And there's not one word of criticism coming out of his mouth. Not one word of criticism. But the thing that puzzles me about this statement, if the Pharisees set her up, if there was sexual violations, if any of those factors, lack of support from family, lack of care and love and environment, why would Jesus put those last words on that sentence? Neither do I condemn thee. What? Go and sin no more. If the sin was not hers initially, and she is acting out behavior as a result of that sin, why would he say, go and sin no more?
Oh,
Yes.
Actually, I wanted to speak to something that you had asked for before you went into this section. While I appreciate Jesus dealing tenderly with the victims and his restoration of them, and you said, well, it's good not to condemn the people who are doing the bad things because we don't know where they come from. And that is true. So Jesus deals tenderly with the victim, but we also recognize that he holds those that were responsible for what she was doing. She ultimately made the choice, but they set her up. He also gives them accountability. And so while we are not to condemn and judge those who are doing the terrible things and deviant behavior and stuff, we do need to realize that they have to be held accountable for their actions, like John Wayne Gacy or Jeffrey Dahmer. Obviously, something in their past had triggered them and they did terrible crimes against children and people. So they are not let off the hook for their actions, even though we have to be understanding where they come from. There is accountability still there.
Yes. So, but I'd like to, you're speaking to something on that last phrase. Go and sin no more.
She actually did commit sin. He's saying, do not go, do it no more. She would do it.
But what if the sin was believing the lies that had been given her by this lack of support, by this abuse, by this destruction? And she believed she was worthless. She believed she was helpless. She believed she had no other option. Maybe that was the sin.
Whenever we have been violent, whenever we have gone through major trauma, we try to compensate for that pain to protect ourselves. And as a result, we develop our own sin patterns. You hear me? We develop behaviors that then become sin. Like, so she may have been raped, for instance. She developed a pattern of promiscuity. So she now has to address the issue that has resulted from somebody else's sin against her. So that's what I think Jesus is saying here. We develop anger, bitterness, resentment, for instance, against someone who has hurt us deeply. Those are our sins. They're not the sin of the other person, but that's where we have to address the sin that we have developed in order to protect our own lives. John?
I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this. The woman sinned. She was in front of these people, and I believe she probably thought, I'm dead.
Yep.
I'm done. And Ruth brings out, in your darkest times, that's when things do happen. So, she sinned and Jesus resolved this. He didn't resolve it by saying, just go leave. But everybody dropped their stone and walked away. Why didn't they just stone her? Jesus, excuse me, and just start throwing stones. We don't buy what you're saying. We're gonna kill her. Why did they walk away? And I think you bring it out, it's a bigger story. How many people were right now, Jesus was an issue right now. I mean, Jesus has said who he was. He has said it. And so they dropped their stones and walked away. I think some of the people in the crowd began to reflect on their own sins. I mean, if you haven't sinned, throw the stone. But you whiz, I have. And Jesus said it, and that must mean something, even though they were trying to make it mean nothing. So when that crowd walked away, there was momentum for Christ there too. I believe they had to reflect on that. And she was at her bottom, like Ruth said, and Christ pulled her out of it. Hence the lesson for all of us.
But what was the issue with the religious leaders about the woman?
No, it wasn't. It was about Jesus. No, yeah, it wasn't. That was the tool. I get it.
Yeah, that was the tool.
So go and sin no more, basically. So what is sin? Sin is not just an action. Sin has to be a belief, and it has a belief system. And so sin has to be, I looked it up because I thought, I don't even know the true definition of sin. It's anything contrary to the will of God. That includes thoughts. As you were talking about, trauma created a belief system in our own head, and we think of, go now and leave your life of sin. Life of sin could be wrong thinking about yourself.
We need to wind it up. There's lots more to this story, and we will revisit this story, I'm sure, in later chapters in the life of Christ. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Ron. I felt it was very important that a lady teach this class. I sort of keep score on who's talking, who's not talking, who's speaking up in this class. At the first part of this class, the guys were chiming in, and we got right to the RAPE words. Didn't hear much, but the ladies picked it up. The ladies started commenting. And I felt it was important. This was a class today that the feminine side needed to be heard. I appreciate what the lady said. I appreciate what you all said. I'm going to pop that out there. Last week, yes, we will refer back to this story. It was one of those tiny, as far as verbiage, paragraph, tiny. To me, it is the gospel story. We can get into Lazarus being raised from the dead. This is the story for me. Last week, I told you we talked about doing things on the Sabbath, that I was going to Rossville. I was going to resolutely turn my face toward Rossville and go down there to buy a drill. I told you that drill was probably going to cost me a lot more than $75. I went. It was exactly like I pictured. I had this guy picture, I had his house picture, I had his stuff picture, except it was neat and ordered. It was right down the line. And so I started talking to him. I started buying a bunch of junk that I don't need. And so when we were finished, we're walking out to the car, and I said, he told me what was wrong with his wife. She has 4 collapsed vertebrae. She had 2 knees replaced, shoulder surgery because of back issues. She was on opioids that affected her colon. She just had 19 feet of her colon removed. She just got hooked back up. They don't know if that's going to work or not. And I'm walking out to the car with all these boxes, and I said, well, do you have any children? Maybe that'd be real easy. He said, no, the old boy she was married to was just an old trunk. And his body slammed her into the coffee table, and she can't have no kids now. So, Mercy, I took all the money that you gave me. I had to stop you last week from giving me cash. That just shows you the kind of people that you are, that I didn't know I was walking into a con artist, a drug addict. I didn't know. But this guy hugged my neck and I was going to get in my car after I paid him. I gave him your money. And I'm walking over and said, can you always do this? Why don't you give the guy more money? And I just cashed a check. I had $1,000 on there, something like that. And I turned and he'd already hugged my neck. And so I went back, gave him some more money. And he said, I sure hope I meet you again someday. And I said, you will. I promise you, you will meet me again someday. The love of God is a wonderful thing. Okay, Lynn has got a real treat for you ladies. We're running behind. Let me have a word of prayer. If anybody wants to get on our email list, please come up and see me. We'll get it. And so let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this story. Thank you for Duane. Thank you for letting us hear it from both sides of the table this morning. Be with us the rest of the day. Help us to enjoy it. Think about these stories. And keep our minds open. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. Anybody want to be on the email?